Hello, thank you for joining me here today at Why the Book Wins, where I compare books with their movie adaptations. My name is Laura, and today I am joined by my sister, Michaeline. So Michaeline, welcome
Hello.
back to the show because she joined me for Where the Crawdads Sing. So if you have not watched that video yet, I will link to it. And today, would you like to tell the audience what we are talking about?
Yes, today we are talking about We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson, which was published in 1962, and the movie by the same name, directed by Stacey Passon in 2018.
And as far as Shirley Jackson goes, I did want to mention I have covered The Haunting of Hill House, which is like probably her more famous novel. So I will link to that if you have not watched that episode. But to start out with the book review, so Michaeline, what did you think of this book?
I thought it was good. It was super short, so it was easy to get through. And I mean, it also keeps your interest because there's little like hints at things. And so you're like trying to figure out
Like you can
what's
feel
actually going on the whole
like
time.
you can tell there's something off.
Yeah.
But yeah, I like this one too, and it was shorter. And I feel like after I finished it, like it definitely is a story where I felt like there was so much symbolism to the story and so many things. Like it felt like there were so many metaphors going on. And so it has been one that has had me thinking for a long time after finishing it. And so even though initially I was kind of like, oh yeah, like that was fine. I think the more I've thought about it, the more I've been able to appreciate it and just like it has more depth than it might initially seem. And this is one people often read in school too. And so I think that makes sense because I feel like there's so much you could talk about and break down with the story. And then onto the movie. What did you think of this movie?
The movie was short, like the book. But I didn't love it.
Would
I
you
liked the
would
book
you
much more.
would you recommend it to people?
The movie?
Yeah.
If they haven't read the book, I would recommend it. If they've read the book, I would tell them they're probably going to be disappointed.
Yeah. I did like it was like the overall plot was faithful to the book, but then they made certain changes that might seem minor, but I feel like it kind of changed the message of the story as a whole. So on the surface, maybe it's like, oh, the events are all the same, but then there's certain changes they make that, yeah, I wasn't a huge fan of. And then the book also, like, I feel like Shirley Jackson is someone who kind of has like a dark, morbid sense of humor at times. And so there were certain aspects of the book that were like kind of funny, but I felt like the movie just took itself more seriously and I didn't really see any dark humor in it.
Yeah.
I did think the casting like was fine.
The casting, yeah. I mean, who they picked for Charles, I think, did a really good job.
Yeah, Charles and Julian.
And Julian, yeah. But I know that Merricat is supposed to be like this weird little girl, but I felt like her looks were like
too weird.
Really? Yeah. Like in the book when I was reading it, I pictured her as like a strange girl, obviously, because that's what she's described as, but also like innocent. And so in the movie, I felt like they made her look very like kind of crazy. And I wanted more of like a juvenile, naive kind of.
Yeah, that's true. Like in the movie, she almost seemed like more intentional, whereas in the book, it was almost like
innocent.
Yeah, more naive or maybe not naive, but yeah. And then, the woman who played Constance, she didn't look the way I imagined Constance. I'm pretty sure they say Constance has blonde hair.
Yeah.
But for the most part, I thought she did a good job in the performance though. And like, she's like always doing that like forced awkward smile.
Yeah.
Like I need to act like everything's fine.
Well, and she was always made up and so fancy, which I also wasn't picturing.
Yeah, and also in the book, they say how Merricat, like she's very dirty. Whereas in the movie, like, yeah, so she didn't have that look either. I was almost imagining like not a homeless girl, but like, she was just always in the dirt and things.
Her hands are often dirty in the movie though.
Oh, interesting. I didn't notice that.
And she
part.
wears like the same thing for a lot of the days, which I was like, is she gonna change?
Yeah. But yeah, that was how it was in the book though, where she just kind of didn't care about her appearance. But yeah, do you have any other spoiler-free thoughts? And then from here, we can just get into the plot details.
No, the main thing is just like the differences in the movie that I didn't like, and those are kind of spoilers.
Okay. So getting into the plot, spoilers from here on out for the rest of the video. So I wanted to start by talking about like Constance and Merricat, their life before Charles shows up. So just kind of like setting the scene of what their life is like. And first off, a change from book to movie is the movie, we get a ton of exposition and voiceover where she's like, oh, Which the book says, like, my name is Merricat and I'm 18 years old and whatever. But in the movie, she goes on to say, like, my sister was accused of poisoning our family, but she was acquitted and now we live separate from the town and whatever. Whereas in the book, I loved how they did it because we just see her going into town and she's like being harassed. And then we don't find out why that's happening until like they have people over for tea. And in the movie, they keep the scene where people are over at tea and they get into the details. So I'm like, they still have that scene. So why did they feel the need to like spoon feed us everything right at the start when instead I think it would have been so much more interesting if it was like the book where you're just watching it being like, oh, like clearly there's something off about her and these kids are like singing this rhyme. So clearly there's some poisoning or something because that's what the rhyme says. So yeah, you just lose that mystery right off the bat with the movie.
Well, and I also didn't like in the movie that when she's going into town in the book, like you are hearing or reading like the thoughts going on in her head. Mm-hmm. But in the movie, it's just like her like going through the motions and stuff. I feel like they didn't emphasize how mean the town people were to her in the movie.
And also,
and so maybe if they had done like a voiceover of like what's going through her head while she's in town, maybe that would have helped. But
yeah. And the lady, like in book and movie, we see her go into this like coffee shop and she orders a black tea or black coffee. And in the book, she says how like she doesn't even want the coffee, but like it's, what's the word? Like she's making a point to be like, I'm going to stay even longer and order my coffee and just make a point to do this. And in the movie, the lady who owns the coffee shop seems much more sympathetic and kind. Whereas in the book, there was a part where the guys come in and are like harassing Merricat. And in the movie, she's like in the book, she's telling them to stop. But it also says that she's like kind of smiling. So like she's finding it amusing, but at the same time, she's like, oh, like you guys really should stop. So that was a difference too from book to movie.
Like I said, they didn't intensify enough.
Yeah.
Like the trauma that going into town gave her.
Yeah. And then to talk about Uncle Julian, which we'll get into Constance in a minute, but so like I said, Constance has been accused of poisoning. So Merricat and Constance are sisters, and Constance was accused of poisoning their parents, Julian's wife. She also poisoned Julian, but he survived. And then I think they had a brother in the book too. Mm-hmm. And so she poisoned their whole family except Merricat, who had been sent to her room without dinner because she'd been in trouble. And so Uncle Julian is interesting because he is someone that like was meant to have died, but then he survives it. But then like his character, he's one where in the book, I felt like I found him kind of a funny character. And we see this in the movie too, how he's like obsessed with the day of the poisoning and everything that led up to it. And he's writing a book about it. And there's a part where we do get this in the movie, but he's talking about the book and he says, I shall commence, I think, with a slight exaggeration and go on from there into an outright lie. I'm going to say that my wife was beautiful. And then there's another part when he's telling Constance to like make sure once he dies that she like takes care of his papers, like this book he's writing. And he says the type of person he wants it to be given to is some worthy cynic who will not be too concerned with the truth. And so he's obsessed with the details and he's constantly talking to Constance being like, oh, like, what did we have for breakfast? Or like, what was this or what was that? And yet at the same time, clearly he's not that interested in the truth because he's just kind of making it up. But what did you think of Julian in both book and movie?
I agree. He was comical in the book just because, yeah, he was so obsessed with it. But it also kind of made it dark because he was so obsessed with it, you know? But in the movie, the first thing I thought when I saw him in the movie was I was surprised how good he looked. Like he's supposed to be like this old, like frail, sickly guy. Yeah. And he looked fine. He just looked like he was in a wheelchair. Yeah, that's true. So, but I felt like when he dies in the end, it was shocking. Because he wasn't, like, super sickly like he was in the book. And they didn't have a doctor come and check on him like they did in the book. So, yeah. So, in the movie, I don't think he was depicted as accurately as he could have been in the book. Because, I don't know, just little details that I feel like would have made it flow better when he does actually die in the end.
Yeah. And we see in both that he like has dementia. So sometimes he will call Constance by the right name. And when Charles shows up, who we'll get to, he keeps calling him John, who is his brother. Oh, and then also like when Charles shows up, like they're eating dinner with Julian at the table. And Charles is pointing out like, man, like this is disgusting. How can you guys put up with this? And apparently Julian just is kind of a mess when he eats. Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting because when Merricat was the narrator, she didn't mention that because she didn't find it odd. So she didn't point it out. So the audience doesn't even realize until this outsider comes in. So that too, where it seems like he isn't as put together as the movie made it seem. And maybe he's just, more of a mess kind of.
Yeah. Well, and then in the movie, when they're sitting down eating dinner and he's talking about that day and he's getting super upset about it, and like Julian like knocks something off the table and like Charles goes off and like goes over and like shoves the napkin around his neck and stuff. And I'm like, okay, that didn't make sense in the movie because like you said, he wasn't making a mess while he was eating.
Whereas, in the book, Charles, he's like, you should put a bib because he's making such a mess. But in the movie, it's like, he was fine. But also something that's interesting with Julian is that, like we said, he kind of has dementia, but he doesn't acknowledge Mary Catherine's existence. Like he says, we find this out near the end too. So throughout the book, like you don't even realize he doesn't think she's there until the end where he's like, Mary Catherine died in the orphanage when Constance was on trial. And that's when you realize that he doesn't even realize she's there. And part of me, like, he talks to Constance in a very normal way. And like about the poisoning, he'll say like, oh, you should have put the poison in this other dish, not the sugar. And so the way he talks to her is like, man, you think she tried to kill you, but you're talking to her in such like a normal, casual way. But part of me wondered, like, do you think Julian really was just delusional? Or do you think he suspected that Merricat really did do the poisoning and that's why he doesn't acknowledge her? Or do you think he really just is unstable and he genuinely believes Constance did do the poisoning and it's just his dementia that's making him not see Merricat?
I mean, I feel like the way he talks to her and like when the two women come over for tea and the way he's talking about it, he says she was acquitted and whatnot, but he makes it seem like he does actually think she was the one to poison them.
Yeah.
Because he mentions like being poisoned and living was awful, you know? So I feel like, it messed with his brain, it messed with his body. He probably doesn't even remember Merricat coming home because he probably doesn't even remember coming home.
That's true.
And so I think that's just part of like his the side effect of being poisoned.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And then to talk about Constance and Merricat. So everybody believes that Constance is the one who poisoned her family, but we realize this near the end. But we find out that Merricat is actually the one who poisoned everybody. And she knows she put arsenic in the sugar, but she knows that Constance doesn't have sugar. And so that's why she put it there. And Constance knows that Merricat poisoned everybody, but she didn't say anything about it at the time. And she has never said anything up until the end of the book. But it's interesting because we find out that, like I said, Merricat had been up in her room because she was in trouble that night, and that's why she wasn't at dinner. And we find out later that like that was a frequent occurrence where Merricat would get in trouble, and Constance says like, oh yeah, so often I would sneak upstairs and bring her dinner because I felt bad for her. So it seems like Constance always wants to like help Merricat because she was kind of like the scapegoat maybe in a way. But then it goes to the point where like even when Constance, like she went through this whole trial, she could have been put to prison or put to death for the murder of her family, and yet she doesn't even seem mad at Mary Catherine for like putting her through that, and she never even acknowledges it, and she just kind of goes along with it. And at this point in the story, she has become agoraphobic, and so that's why Merricat is the one who goes into town. And Merricat seems to like it that way, because then when the women come to tea and they're like, oh, you should come out and be part of society, Constance, Merricat, especially in the book, but in the movie too, like she gets really upset about this, and she's like, no, like she wants her to stay isolated in this house.
She wants her all to herself.
Yeah, and we hear her say how like, oh, Constance is the most precious person in my life. And so it seems like she loves her, but in like a controlling kind of way.
In a very unhealthy way.
Yeah. And then also like, so Merricat is often burying things in the ground as part of like different spells, which in the movie, she's reading a book about like witchcraft and spells. But in the book, it seems like she just was making this up.
Yeah.
Like she would just decide like, I'm just going to bury this thing and it will cause protection, or I'm just going to pick this word. And once I say it, like, so she wasn't like following some book that told her how to do it. So I thought that was also just an interesting quirk to her character. And again, a minor change to the movie. And yet the fact that in the book, she was just making it up as she goes, I thought just added something to her.
To show that she was a little off, and that's why she poisoned her family.
Yeah, and that she kind of believes things for no apparent reason. Like there's a point where she picks these 3 words that like have power. For no apparent reason, she just decides like this word will have power. And it's like, okay.
Yeah. And the moon. She talked about the moon a ton in the book.
Yeah.
And in the movie, I think she mentioned it twice. So it was just kind of like what's that about?
Yeah. And I do want to get to that like near the end after we've gone over the plot, because I feel like, again, like you just said, that was like a bigger thing in the book. But also like Merricat, like we just said, she has these like silly ideas. And throughout the book, Constance, like, she doesn't chastise her, but she'll just be like, oh, silly Merricat. Like, she doesn't play along, but she also just kind of lets her do whatever she wants.
Yeah. She's feral.
Yeah, that's kind of a good way to phrase her.
Okay. Jonas also wasn't a huge thing in the movie. And that was like one of, I felt like that was kind of like the cat was like part of her.
Yeah.
At spells or, you know.
Yeah, kind of like how
like Bell Book and Candle.
Yeah, we're like an animal.
Yeah.
Like also Harry Potter. Harry Potter has it where they have to have an animal and it's like their thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, because Jonas, which is her cat, he was in so much more of the book. And yeah, it definitely seemed like he was more symbolic or there was something more to him.
They could have not even had him in the movie and it wouldn't have changed anything.
Yeah.
But he made a big difference in the book.
Yeah, very
because
true.
She hated that Charles would like pet him and, you know.
Yeah. And speaking of Charles, so this is their cousin. So his father, like, cut the family off during the trial, but then his father has died. So Charles comes to the house and he's like, hey, like, I hate what happened and I'm here to, like, make amends and just, like, kind of help you guys out. And it was interesting because, like I said, Charles brings this, like, outsider's perspective into the home. And he also just, like, points out how unusual things are, like we said with Julian. And he's like, man, Julian should be in a hospital. Like, Constance, you shouldn't have to be taking care of him. And then Merricat, he's very, like, he does not like Merricat, partly because she doesn't like him. But he also gets so upset at just, like, her strange ways. And, like, she's always burying things, valuable things, including money. And he's like, why do you let her do this, Constance? Like, you need to stop this. And his presence starts Constance feeling like, oh, it's all my fault. Like, I shouldn't have let things get this way. Like, Julian should be in a hospital. And Merricat, like, you should be out dating. Like, I should have you shower more. Like, you're just this wild child. Like, what have I done? And then also something that was not in the book. In the movie, there's like this sexual tension between Constance and Charles. And he kind of woos her with talk of like taking her away to see the world. And what did you think of this change? Because I didn't sense any attraction between them in the book. So this is like, in my mind, it was exclusive to the movie.
I kind of disagree. So in the movie, like, they intensified it for sure.
Yeah.
And it was kind of awkward feeling.
Yeah. They were cousins, remember?
Right. Which is one reason it was awkward, but also just like the way they were acting. And you can tell he's like totally just trying to get at her because
and manipulate her.
She has money.
Yeah.
Yeah. But in the book, I kind of sensed the same thing.
Oh, interesting.
Because there was a part where like they're in one of the rooms together and Merricat comes in and sings something to them. And he's like, oh, you need to leave. Like, we have things to discuss. And like, I don't know. I felt like some of the things that he was saying to Merricat about him and Constance alluded to the fact that like they were going to get married or they were going to do something. But maybe I was misinterpreting that. So, I mean, in the movie, I wasn't surprised when they alluded to those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Because that's what I got from the book, too.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And this was 1962, which obviously, like, way back in the day, marrying your cousin was very normal. I don't know about the 60s, but they did come from, like, an old money family. And sometimes, like, these old money type families, like, kind of like to keep it in the family to some extent. So yeah, so maybe it was in the book and it just kind of went over my head.
Well, and that's what grossed me out is like, this is the 60s. Marrying your cousin wasn't okay then. So was I misinterpreting this? Because,
Well, the fact that the movie really went for it. Yeah, maybe it really had been in the book. So I would be curious to read it again and see what I think. Which, by the way, as you're watching this video, if you have thoughts on the story, definitely comment down below. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you have not already. But yeah, in the book, it's interesting too, because Merricat is often referring to Charles as a ghost, being like, oh, he's just this ghost, this demon that I need to get rid of. And in both book and movie, she like does different stuff to just annoy him and try to drive him away. And she even straight up asks him like, I would like you to leave now. Yeah, and he was really rude to her in both book and movie. And he says the line where he's like, in a week's time, I wonder who will still be here, you or me. But then at one point, she sees his pipe in his bedroom. And she decides to like cause a fire with his pipe. And so they're out eating dinner and then they smell smoke. And Charles runs to the town to get like, the fire department. And while he's leaving, Merricat and Constance, they like hide from the townspeople.
Yeah, that was another thing I didn't like with the movie because they stayed hidden in the book.
Well, like the firefighters are putting the fire out and the townspeople are like, you should just let it burn. Like, this family sucks. But the firefighter is like doing his job. And once the fire is out, though, the firefighter in both book and movie, he picks up a rock and throws it at the window. And then the town kind of cheers and they all start like throwing rocks and going inside of the house and kind of just tearing it apart. And then I think it was in both, they end up finding Constance and Merricat and they like bring them out and they're just kind of like being ridiculed and like persecuted in this moment. And yeah, I think that was in the book because I remember in the book, Constance had Julian's shawl and it talked about how like she had it over her head so that she wouldn't like have to see the people. But yeah, but all of this ends when someone comes out and they're like, hey, like Julian is dead. Someone has died. Like you guys all need to just leave.
But like one of the things in the book that I liked was like while I was reading it, I was trying to figure out like, okay, like there's some kind of twist here. And I like was trying to figure out what the twist was. And so when Charles mentions Merricat and just how he doesn't like her and how she is and everything because it's not right. And Julian is like, she died in the orphanage of neglect. Blah, blah, blah. That's the part when I was like, is that the twist? Because like that's kind of what I was thinking. I was like, maybe she's not actually alive.
Yeah.
And like Constance is just like making her up in her head.
Yeah.
So when Charles shows up and he's talking to Merricat, that's when it's like, okay, she actually is alive because he's not crazy. But so the beginning when they're talking about like she's at the diner and she's drinking her coffee and the guys come in and they're harassing her and they're like, oh, I hear that you're not going to be here for much longer. And she's like we're not going anywhere kind of thing, you know? And then Charles shows up and she follows him into town. And in the book, she sees him at that diner, like talking and having a good time with the men who harass her in town. And so my thing was like, in the book, maybe Charles had like called someone in town ahead of time to like let them know he was coming. And that's why in the beginning when they're like, oh, I hear you're not going to be here much longer, is because they knew Charles was coming and was going to push her out. You know?
That's a good point.
But yeah, and then in the movie, like Charles goes into town and it's like a totally different story. It's like he's not getting along with the townspeople and they don't like him because he's a Blackwood. When in the book it was the total opposite. And that's another reason why Merricat didn't like him is because he's getting along with all these people she hates.
Yeah. Yeah. So true. And he's acting like Constance's friend and like he cares about her. But then it's like, how can you be all chummy with these people who treat us so terribly and you're acting like you're trying to help us? Which, yeah, he was like so obsessed with the safe because their dad didn't believe in banks. And so all the money's in the safe. And so he's like, when the fire is happening so often in book and movie, he's like, Constance, get the safe. Like, did you get the safe? Like, the safe, where is it? And then, of course, like I said, when he sees Merricat burying money, he's like, do you see what she's doing? Like, this is so valuable. But yeah, and so then after the fire, the movie only shows like the following day or two after the fire, whereas in the book we see like a long time afterwards. And so this book was cool because like the house, they don't fix it up, and so vines are growing over it. And in the book she doesn't refer to the house as a castle until after the fire has happened because she feels like the way the top is burned looks like a castle. And so it's almost like, you know, a lot of stories about haunted houses or something, like this is like an origin story of how the house became that way, and we get the whole backstory to it. But one thing that was really interesting was in book and movie, the neighbors who had been like ruining their house, you know, the night before, they start coming and dropping off food for them. And in the movie, they do this in the daytime and it's like all at once at the same time. Whereas in the book, this was like over the course of an extended period.
I didn't like that change either.
Yeah.
Because like everyone coming on the same day doesn't make as big of a statement as people coming week and days after days after it happening.
And they always came at night in the book.
Yeah.
So it's interesting because like that mob mentality where like the town is a group, they're like, oh, we hate the Blackwoods. But then when they go to their individual homes, suddenly they feel bad for what they did and they want to like make amends for it by giving food. But they're probably too worried about judgment. So they're like, well, I can't do it in the daytime because someone might see. So I'll go at night. And yeah, and it's not in the movie. It's like this food is piling up. So everybody sees that other people have been there. And so I think like, because the Blackwoods are very isolated in this town, but it almost shows how like all the townspeople are isolated in their way because they're worried about judgment from all the other people, including like, and they're part of the judgment when they're part of that mob mentality. So yeah, so I thought that part was really interesting. And then Charles visiting is different as well. And since I'm doing so much talking, do you want to talk about Charles in the movie when he comes back?
In the movie, when Charles comes back.
Which is like the next day.
Yeah. So in the movie, He comes back, he's pounding on the door, obviously, because that's who he is, and he's yelling, and he's telling Constance to let him in, and he's come back to help them, like
being manipulative.
Yeah, basically what he's been doing the whole time he's been there. And he like goes to the kitchen window, which is where Constance and Merricat were, and now they're hiding under the table, and he's yelling at her and telling Constance that she'll never find anyone to love her the way he loves her. And yeah, just manipulating.
Classic abuser words.
Trying to break her down.
Yeah.
And she almost does, because like she stands up and she's crying and it looks like she's about to say something, and then he ends up getting into the house and he breaks down the kitchen door. Constance falls on the floor and he's like going after her. And one of the things in the movie too with Constance is she has this globe of like the Leaning Tower of Pisa. And so that was one of the things that didn't get ruined during the fire and the raid and everything. And so it's sitting on the table and Merricat picks it up and like hits him on the head. He gets on the ground. He's blood coming out of his head a ton and everything. And she hits him again with it. And then it shows them dragging him outside and burying him.
Getting rid of the evidence.
I didn't like that scene at all.
Yeah. And in comparison, in the book, he comes to their house, like it feels like it's months later, it seems. Maybe not months, but it's like
it wasn't
weeks.
The next day.
Yeah, some time had passed. And he comes with a friend, and they can hear he and the friend talking, and he's telling the friend, like, yeah, they have so much money in there. And he's also talking about, like, maybe he doesn't straight out say it.
It was a reporter.
Oh, it was a reporter. I didn't remember that part.
Because he was like, you're going to pay me for this story,
Oh, that's right. Yeah. And he's also saying, like, he doesn't straight out say it, but it seems like he alludes to being like, oh, like, I can manipulate them. Like, don't worry. And so he's trying to get them to open the door, but then, like, they don't open the door. And so then they both, Charles and the reporter, end up driving off and leaving, and that's that. But Constance, like, this definitely is when she realizes that he definitely didn't care about her, right? And because she heard the way he was talking about them, and so she's just like, wow. So it's a difficult moment for her, but at the same time, like, it wasn't nearly as dramatic as the movie.
Well, and she's laughing in the book.
Yeah, true, because they're having to, like, stifle their laughter.
And I think that's also showing, like, she's like, man, this guy is a joke. I can't believe I fell for him. Because, yeah, now she's laughing about how stupid he is.
Yeah. And while we're talking about Charles attacking Constance, something I left out when we were talking about it was before he smells the smoke that night when Merricat sets the house on fire, they'd like got into a disagreement and then he like attacks Merricat, but then he stops attacking her because then he smells smoke. And again, that was not in the book. So what did you think of this aspect of having Charles just be more physically violent?
I didn't like it, but I don't like violence in general, I guess. I didn't feel like it was needed to amplify what a horrible person he was.
Yeah.
Like, we already knew he was horrible. We knew he was there for money. And so him being physical with Merricat, and I didn't like Constance's reaction to it either, where she was just like standing there crying, like not, like she kept a distance. Whereas I'm like, if that was happening to like my sister or someone that I was super close to, like I wouldn't just be like, oh my gosh, I can't do anything. Like you don't
like
think
you would
about
step in.
Yeah, you don't think about yourself in that kind of circumstance. You like you're defending someone you love, so you're not just gonna stand by and watch it.
Yeah. Which I do think though Constance, maybe especially in the movie, she was more like non-confrontational, like always with that smile being like, oh, let's act like everything is fine. I can't acknowledge things that are wrong because I hate confrontation, basically. So it did fit her character to just be like, what do I do?
Yeah. The other thing, though, is how Merricat kept saying father when Charles was attacking her. Like, it had happened multiple times where her dad would be attacking her. And so she was like, father, no, father, stop. And so maybe that's partly why Constance was, like, not doing anything.
It was, like, triggering PTSD. Yeah. Which, another huge change we haven't talked about is that in the movie, so after the fire, in both book and movie, Merricat says something like, I'm going to put death in their food and kill them all. And Constance is like you did last time, which is when we realized that Merricat was the one who did the poisoning. And in the movie, they have some added dialogue where Constance is like, like, I know it was you and, like, it's okay because father was like a wicked man. And basically he was physically abusive. And that's why Merricat poisoned the family because the father was abusive and the mom just stood by and let it happen. And that, again, huge change because in the book, we don't get any of that. And I feel like having it, like, it almost like dumbs down the story and makes it more basic basic by being like, oh, like they're victims of these abusive men and now they're killing them. And it makes them less interesting as characters. Because in the book, like we see that the dad is like very greedy and he's mean. And Merricat is often punished, but they specifically talk about her just going to bed without dinner. And so it almost seems like Merricat poisoned them, not because they were like evil, as in they were like physically abusive, but it seems like she just didn't like them. And so she poisoned them. And yeah, so just having it be like, oh, like they're just victims getting revenge on abusive men. Yeah, I felt like it made the plot more basic.
Yeah, that was one of the things I liked about the book and didn't like about the book. Sometimes I do like black and white.
Yeah.
But yeah, with the book, they give you enough to know that they weren't good parents.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, that could mean a whole different array of things. So you're kind of left to make it up on your own.
Yeah. And like you were saying earlier with Merricat in the book, she definitely just seemed a bit more off. Whereas in the movie, she was very intentional. Like her parents were abusing Constance and herself. So she took it into her own hands and killed them. Whereas in the book, it seems like I don't know if I would say she has a personality disorder, but she definitely just seems off. And in both book and movie, we have the scene where she is fantasizing about a dinner with her parents. Mm-hmm. And in the movie, this scene is where we learn that like she must have been punished by her father and the mom just let it happen. That's like how that scene read in the movie. Whereas in the book, that scene where she's imagining a dinner where the parents are like, oh, Mary Catherine is our most loved child and she should get whatever she wants and she will never be punished and she never even does anything that's like needs to be punished and she's just an amazing person. That read like she was kind of like had an inflated ego and was maybe more delusional, thinking that's how they should have treated her because she does deserve everything good and doesn't acknowledge her own flaws in a way. And in the book, Merricat is often referred to as being wicked because she was just like a naughty kid, it sounds like. So yeah, her personality just was very different from book to movie.
Yeah. Well, and if you think about it, the poisoning and death happened years before the book and the movie. So she was like an early teen. She was all hormonal and trying to...
Yeah. She was like 13 years old or something. 12.
Yeah. Teens often don't think that they're in the wrong ever. So.
Right. They like are very self-centered. Yeah. Yeah, very true.
Not anything against teens. It's a rough stage of life.
And then, so like I said, in the movie, we just see like the initial 2 days after this. And it's interesting too, because in both, like all of their clothes are burned. So Constance is like, we need to like wear Uncle Julian's clothes or just make our own. And so she makes Merricat like this toga dress thing out of a tablecloth, but it's like a checker tablecloth. Whereas in the movie, she makes them clothing out of a white tablecloth. And, you know, like fire can symbolize like purification and like new beginnings and things. And so then the fact that they're both wearing white also symbolizes like rebirth and purification. And also it makes them more ghostly looking too, which the house basically...
It kind of creeps me out for some reason. I don't know why.
Yeah, like it makes them... Yeah, like have that ghostly look, I think. While also making it seem, showing their goodness, right? Because like they were in the right, protecting themselves against these evil men. And so just having them wear white, I kind of liked it. I thought it was a nice touch to the movie. Oh, and then another part I wanted to talk about in book and movie, and I feel like this had more meaning in the book. They start like is lore around the house. And so people will be like, hey, kids, get away. Like there's witches in there and they eat children. And in both, Merricat is like, I wonder if I could eat a child. And Constance is like, I don't know how I would cook one, or I don't know if I could cook one. But in the book, I thought this was a pivotal moment because throughout the book, when Merricat like says these silly things, Constance replies being like, oh, silly Merricat. Whereas now, like, she's actually playing along. So it seems like she has kind of like gone all in Merricat's way of thinking, which brings me to the moon, which like you said, Merricat is often being like, oh, on the moon, it'll be this way. And on the moon, we'll do it this. And like, you should come with me to the moon. And at the end of the book and movie, Constance says like, oh, I'm so happy now that they're like totally isolated. And Merricat is like, I knew you would like it on the moon, meaning her idea of the moon is just to live, just the two of them and nobody else. And again, like in the movie, this made it seem like Merricat just like cared so much about Constance and wanted to protect her and keep her away from these terrible people. But in the book, like it makes Merricat almost seem like more manipulative, because often like manipulators and abusers, like they want to isolate the people they're manipulating, right? And so the fact that she wants to keep Constance all to herself, away from everybody, and at the end she gets what she wants. And she's like, yes, like now I have her to myself and we're on the moon and we're never going to see anybody ever again. So yeah, what did you think of the ending of book and movie, like, and reading the situation differently, having them be so isolated? I
mean, not to backtrack, but the whole like killing Charles and stuff, I didn't like that
Mm-hmm.
added ending for the movie because I felt like it was better that he just left, you know? Like you were mentioning, they're all dressed in white. I mean, they just killed someone. Like, that doesn't show purity.
Yeah.
But in the book, yeah, it's like, I think the townspeople coming and ruining their house and just being horrible to them essentially kind of, I don't know, solidifies it for Constance, because in the beginning when she's talking with the two women that come over, they're like, oh, you need to get out, like you need to do things. And you can tell like she's kind of interested, and that's why Merricat freaks out and she's like, no, she can't go out.
Yeah.
But after they come and ruin the house and everything, she's like, Merricat's right. Like, maybe I'm not the right one, she is. And so she just kind of, like you said, like adopts Merricat's way of thinking and just kind of in La La Land, I guess. But in the book, I mean, it was cut super short, so you don't see as much of what happens to them. Because I don't know, I feel like it's kind of ended abruptly, whereas like it's showing that the townspeople are sorry, and it's just kind of like they're over it, and it's just gonna be them too. Whereas in the book, it's showing like the townspeople coming over a period of time to show their regret for how they've been. And they talk about how like there's kids now that play near their house, and that's never happened before. So in the book, I feel like, yeah, they're isolated and it's just going to be them two, but they're also more a part of society than they were before. Whereas the movie, it's like, nope, it's just them two and that's it. And that's the end.
That's true, because in the end of the book, like their house becomes like a key part of the town, being like, oh, like the creepy Blackwood home and all the like the lore and the like the rumors that are spread about them. That's true. And I also wanted to talk about how when the parents were alive, like the father was just like he was very rich, and yet he was very greedy. And Julian and his wife were actually living with them because they were poor. And yet, even though John is the name of the father, even though he was rich, he was like very particular about like how much food Julian and his wife ate, and like the cost that their presence was having on the Blackwoods, even though they had plenty of money. And also like it talks about him making a list of like people that owe him something in one way or other, and then he doesn't trust the banks, like we said. And so even before the murders, they were isolated from the town because they thought they were so much better than the town. And so they weren't really part of society anyway. And then after the murders, they're like cut off from the town because they don't go to town, and because of now, you know, they're like a murder house at this point. And then I also wanted to talk about real quick, you know, talking about how John was so greedy, and Charles, right? So the main two men, Julian, not so much. So specifically Charles and John the father, they were so focused on money and like worldly things. Whereas Constance and Merricat, like they were very connected to nature. Like Constance plants things, like she's always like growing things in the garden. And Merricat is constantly burying things in the ground. And so it's interesting because they're living this life like very connected to nature, you could say, and just doing their thing. When Charles, this like worldly presence comes in, and he's just focused all about the money. And then same with John, he was very focused about the money. And then in the end, you know, obviously with the father, they end up killing him. So then like they kind of win in that situation. And then even with Charles, he leaves defeated, not getting any of the money. And then it's interesting too that Julian, even though like she tried to kill him too, just like everybody else. And so I feel like the fact that he lives, but now he's like an invalid, is also like symbolic of how, you know, the dominance shift, where instead of the men being the dominant gender in the household, now the women are, because Julian, you know, like the men have been crippled, quote unquote. And so the women now like are the more powerful ones, just like deciding how things are going to happen. And then again, Charles comes in, you know, the man trying to like overthrow the woman, but they still, you know, maintain their reign and get rid of Charles. So yeah, did you have any thoughts on like the gender politics within this book or movie? And also like how Constance, she is always cooking. Even before her family died, she was like the cook, which is considered like a womanly role. And she uses that. They think she uses that. Obviously it's Merricat, but she uses that role of, you know, the household, whatever, cooking. She uses that against them, and that's how they end up dying.
I didn't think about gender roles, honestly, because even before Charles shows up, I didn't feel like the women were in charge necessarily. Like they were all equals. Like Constance was still really nice to Julian. He was crazy and like talking about this day incessantly, and she's just like patient and answers his question with a smile, you know. But yeah, Charles, for sure, they talk about how he looks just like father.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
he's come in to take his place.
He like sits at the head of the table where their father had sat.
Yeah.
And I think he sleeps in his room too.
He does.
So yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting in the movie too, is when they're sitting and eating dinner and Charles is saying something mean to Julian and Julian says, "That's my brother's chair." He's like, "John used to sit there." And he's like, "Last time I saw him there, he was foaming at the mouth."
Yeah.
And like that image is just like, oh. Like,
yeah.
that's the chair you're sitting in, buddy. What's that say about your destiny?
Yeah. Yeah. Very true. Some foreshadowing there. Even though he doesn't, well, because that's specific to the movie, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely foreshadowing. And now before we get to book versus movie, which I'm sure you're all wondering which one we could possibly prefer. But before we get to that, did you have any final thoughts just on any other details we didn't quite get to?
I can't think of anything. I feel like I've said everything I wanted to about the differences.
Okay, so in that case, when it comes to book versus movie, just to reiterate kind of what we've already been saying, which one wins and why?
The movie. Just kidding. No, the book. Obviously, I said that in the beginning.
Yeah.
Just because the book, I mean, I have issues. Now that I've started reading books, I used to just watch the movies because I didn't like reading. But since reading books, I'm definitely one of those snobs that's like, the movie is never as good as the book. Because, I mean, they change it. And oftentimes I don't like the changes that they make because even though they're slight or like murdering a guy isn't really...
It's a big change to the end.
It changes the story, and I just don't like that. Like, if you're gonna make a movie about a book, at least keep it true to what it is. Like, if I was the author, I would be like, why are you changing, like, this major part of the story? Like, that totally changes who the girls are.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Which some relative of Shirley Jackson who like owns her estate or whatever now. Like they did a 1999 adaptation of Haunting of Hill House called The Haunting. And he was super upset with how that adaptation came out because it was so much like its own thing. And so with this one, he was like very closely connected to the making of it because he wanted to make sure it stayed true to Shirley Jackson's book. And yeah, like I said, like aside from the murder of Charles, like the details are like the same. But my biggest complaint is the fact that they were like physically abused by their parents, their father, as well as Charles. And just that right there just makes so many differences to the story and to the characters. And like I said, it almost makes it seem like more basic, where it's just like, oh,
you don't have to think as much.
Yeah, like they were just getting revenge on their abusive dad. And it just makes it less interesting and less ambiguity too, which...
It dumbs it down for sure.
And Shirley Jackson, I've only read her 2 books, but she's definitely not one for like black and white stories. And it's just like, there's so much to think about and so much symbolism and so much ambiguity. And I think that's why a lot of people like her books. And so the fact that they made that change here, that's my biggest complaint. So yeah, I would also say that the book wins, which to be fair, like I didn't love this book and it wasn't one like... I was curious like what the twist would be, but it's pretty short, but it took me a number of days. Like when I put it down, I was never in a rush to return to it. So I kind of took my time reading it. But like I said, it's one that over time, the more I've thought about it, the more I've grown to like it because I think there is just like so much to delve into. And while we got into like the symbolism and the metaphors to some extent, there's like so much more that we could be like breaking down with this story. So yeah, so the book wins. For sure, as far as both of us go.
Yep.
So yeah, I guess that wraps it up unless you had any final thoughts.
Don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already.
Yeah. And I mentioned my video for The Haunting of Hill House. So if you want to watch that, I will link to it on the screen. So definitely click that if you want more Shirley Jackson content and also more, more content to put you in the Halloween spirit. So yeah, thank you again to Michaeline for joining me for today's episode.
You're welcome.
And I wanted to do a shout out to our sister-in-law, Madeline, who is like the reason we covered this. So Madeline, definitely, if you don't have a YouTube account, definitely text us and let us know your thoughts on this episode. So thank you so much for watching and I will see you next time. Bye.
Bye.